Hi, back from your stretch. We're here for part three of chapter six on how to tell the stories. And we're now to the latter part of storytelling. We talked the last part on what is the story and how to construct it. And now we're going to talk a little bit about telling it, although this is more about more the structure. So, structure for stories is actually really important. In my view, in fact, the organization is more important than grammar, and I'll get back to that in a second. But grammatical errors are not good, but for the reader, they're not near as bad as these problems. Illogical sequences of ideas. Why am I reading this? What are these details? Right, when I don't know what the big picture is. No pattern organization. Is the section moving from most important to least important, from least to most in time? If I can't recognize the pattern, then I get frustrated as a reader. But as we see, people want to connect things. They want to find associations. So they're going to try and invent patterns when there aren't any, and then they're frustrated when that turns out to not be it, and the next thing breaks it. So these are important things you want to cover. You have to understand what is the flow of ideas. If you feel as you're starting over and over again with each new sentence or each new paragraph, right, it just doesn't work in terms of writing. And then finally, if it's jumpiness, if you jump from one topic to another, there'll be some techniques where we can do a little bit of jumping, but it has to be connected in some way. And sometimes that can be done with just a couple of sentences to connect them. But these are organizational problems. And you can actually pay somebody to fix grammar and spelling, right? But you can't fix somebody to fix your ideas. You're not going to easily have somebody reorganize your stuff into a classic story, into a story structure. So we're going to look at 10 or 11 classic story writing structures. The first is what is often called the classic story structure, the classic arc, the hero's journey, and there's a whole bunch of variations of that. And I'll have a bonus, which I call Oscar, which is actually just a variation on this, but it's the one I teach in my graduate classes. Then we'll look at some more specialized ones, the inverted pyramid or bottom line on top, braided esters, interwoven stories, compare and contrast style, problem solution, cause and effect, circular narrative, the listicle, the chronological order, and epistology. Most of these are actually somewhat suited to tactical writing. There's a whole bunch of other writing structures, right, which we're not going to get into. There's a ton of poetry. There's stream of consciousness. There's a bunch of things that people might use to write, but they don't really lend themselves very well to the tactical writing. So these are going to be the ones we're going to mostly touch on. So let's start with variations of what's called the narrative arc, the hero's journey, Freytag's pyramid, right? And we'll actually differentiate some of these in just a slide or two. But the key point here is this is a classical structure for many, many compelling stories. The nice thing about this is it's actually what people expect. In fact, earlier I already used a version of this, right? It's a journey from exposition of the ideas to either rejoice or denouncement, depending on how the story wants to end, happy or dejected. There's going to be the encounter of conflicts, obstacles, builds tension through the rising action, and it resolved with some sense of closure, either positive or negative, right? And it provides a framework for this tension and closure to make sense. And again, things have to make sense. There has to be a reason for stuff going on for the audience to figure out and follow what's going on. So the first of these is a story in 3 acts. The first act is the setup. There's some inciting incident, something that happens that make the sort of story start off with something. And then somewhere in the middle, there's some sort of confrontation, some challenge, that's the midpoint, and then there's a resolution and a climax. And again, the classic stories, you've all heard hundreds of stories probably in this format, but it can be used for tactical writing where you set things up, have some challenge you have to overcome, and then reach the climax. Freytag's pyramid is a particular instantiation of this a little bit farther, where we have, in Freytag's version, you actually have 5 stages: the introduction, the rise, the climax, the return or fall, and a catastrophe. Generally, if there's going to be a negative outcome, this is a more consistent structure where the climax, something positive happens, and then bad things have to happen after that. So this is a 5-act strategy structure. And the classic, which you probably all heard about in high school, was this idea of what's called the hero's journey, where you start up here at the top of the journey. In an ordinary world, there's some sort of call. You might have to talk them into doing this, right? So there's a little bit of back and forth, maybe meeting with a mentor to sort of decide, okay, yes, I'm going to go out. And then they go out. They start the journey. Then there's a test with some enemies, maybe some allies to help them. approach to the innermost code, which is like the difficult thing, the most difficult thing they have to do. And then there's some sort of ordeal, some fight, some struggle, and there might be multiple little pieces of this, but there's always at least one major battle that goes on in a hero's journey. And then some sort of reward where something positive happens. And then the hero's journey is returning home, so there's some road back, some positive things happen, their resurrection, something, they're reborn, they're reconsidered, in the Odyssey, right, they come back and see what's going on, or they might return with something special. And this can either end in a positive note or as a tragedy in a negative note. Both of these can be done within the hero's journey. Again, all of these are sort of classic storytelling elements. And you can really use classic storytelling presentations to make it easier for people to relate to the presentation. They understand there's going to be a climax. They understand there's going to be some resolution. In fact, if they're doing this and they're watching TV, they actually know it's got to be resolved in 5 more minutes. We got to have to get through this, right? So they'll literally be looking at their watch, or in a movie they know what the time is. So you actually build that into your anticipation of what's happening. But when you're doing tactical writing, you're writing for a reason, and so some of the venues you're going to be writing for will have very standardized structures. Most proposals and most scientific articles are rather fixed in their layout, right? But you can still alter the story structure within that layout. So we want to separate just a little bit the structure, how many sections does it have, where do these answers go, and the stories you want to tell. Because we can have micro stories that follow different structures, and we can have the overall big story if I have one thing. This is not a novel. It's not even a novella. It's tactical writing, and it might only be 2 paragraphs long. It might be 2 sentences long. It might be 200 pages long, right? You got to figure out how big the story is and where it's going to structure. But the sequencing of ideas is part of the structure that you're going to look at. So let's look at some others. In fact, maybe the most common in tactical writing for many things is what I would consider the inverted pyramid. Even in my scientific writing, I will actually use this a lot. In the inverted pyramid, you have it's common in journalism and business, but you in some sense start off with the most important stuff first, and then the details taper off. It captures immediate, quick attention, delivers key news quickly, which is why it's common in journalism. But it can actually be very effective because of the brevity and clarity of what's going to happen. In my view, it's the best choice for business emails. You want to put what we call the bottom line on top, blot. But that's the same as the headline in journalism. You want to have something that gets them interested right away. Even when I'm writing science papers, this is a part of what happens inside the abstract. Science paper is structured with multiple sections, but there's an abstract. And the abstract is the bottom line of the entire paper. It hits all of the things. But I still want to hit, even in that, with the most important thing, then some important details, and then eventually some background details. And then actually I like to wrap it up with the bottom line on top and on bottom, because you want to actually remind them at the end of all the good things you did. So when we look at that inverted pyramid, right, we get this structure, and it's inverted because the details, right? Oddly enough, sometimes I actually like to draw this as, if you draw it in terms of the length of material, it's a proper pyramid because the headline is small, the lead is in the middle, and the background has a lot more of the stuff, and that's actually the common thing you would see in some styles of writing. Another technique which can be useful, I find it particularly useful in proposals, is what is called a braided essay or interwoven substories or interwoven stories. And the idea here is you interweave multiple narrative threads together. They can be some mix of personal anecdotes, personal stories, histories, philosophy, and it's a nonlinear progression. So a little bit like there are 3 stories in this drawing here. There's white, maybe 4, white, gray, green, and yellow, and they sort of pop up here and there. But if each strand is connected, the next time you see it, they have this nice connection, but then it can bring up something else. And this is one of the cases where if it's not done right, it can quickly become jumpy and very hard to follow. It's important that when you do this, you explicitly make the connections where you say, in section 2 we did this, or in this figure, make a connection that lets them know that I'm back to the green story, or I'm onto the gold story. You got to make those changes clear because those changes are part of what it takes to understand what's going on in a braided essay. But it's great because you can have a bunch of distinct ideas woven together, and it provides a non-linear progression that makes it a little easier, and you don't necessarily have to have the concept of time. It's concept of pieces of stories put together. Another very classic approach used in tactical writing, especially in the sciences and business, is compare and contrast, right? You basically analyze in contrasting subjects, right? So this is a compare and contrast diagram. We say we have the blue and the yellow. You talk about what's in blue. You talk about what's in yellow. Those are the differences, and then there might be something in common. You can flip it around. You can talk about what is the compare. So you do all the things they share, and then you talk about the differences and the importances. It's very popular in academic writing. It highlights both the similarities and the differences. You can basically use it as a way of arguing for or against any particular point, because you can talk about the similarities or the differences depending on what you want to emphasize. But it's also useful because it provides for a deeper understanding, which is one of the reasons it can help. Using compare and contrast as your writing style is not necessarily the same as you doing a compare and contrast analysis to figure out how you want to understand stuff, but using it in your writing style gives you a chance to put things together. And again, this might be braided in with other things when you tell a story about the importance of a topic, and then you use compare and contrast in the deeper parts of your Act 2 in the middle, where you're analyzing stuff so you can reach a conclusion. Very much related, but not necessarily, but doesn't require two different subjects, is the problem-solution approach. This can be effective in persuasive writing because you try and basically present a problem and then a solution. Doesn't work if you present the solution first and then the problem. So this is sort of almost the opposite of the bottom line on top. The solution is the bottom line, but you use this if you have to educate your audience about what the problem really is, because either there's so many related problems you want to be clear about exactly which one you're doing, or because they may not even recognize that it's a problem, then the problem solution is a better approach than putting the bottom line on top. So in persuasive writing, where you have to convince them of both the problem and the solution, it's great. It allows you, if it's done right, to demonstrate some authority on the subject. If you're an authority, it's easier to use this model. If not, then you have to demonstrate your authority by having citations to back up what's going on. You identify the challenge. So this makes the challenge part of your 8 essential elements really easy because you've made it very clear. And it proposes actionable solutions. Again, you might see that this is a very natural part for a proposal. And again, if we have interwoven stories in a proposal, it might be that we have a part of it is a problem solution, and another part is compare and contrast, where we're looking at alternative solutions. Both of those can live together in the same woven together story with both of these pieces put together. But the goal here is to engage and persuade the reader to act, and so you can actually think of it as problem solution act, where you really want to get to the act at the end when you're doing tactical writing. Chronological order arranges events by time. It's very useful in history-oriented storytelling, so telling the history of part of your company as a reason to do something. This would be the natural thing to do. It conveys progression, so there's this advancing of ideas, advancing of things over time, which is natural. But you have to remember that the human mind likes to see temporally stated events as connected in a causal fashion. This happens next, and there must be a cause between the two. And you can actually be exploiting that when you're not sure what the cause is. Putting things in chronological order gives a suggestion that there is a little bit of this. If your audience is very sophisticated, though, they'll say correlation or progression is not causation, and they can beat you up a little bit. So you have to be careful when you try and use that. But because you do it implicitly and you don't call it out, it's actually a little easier. You can add context to events, so you can basically set stage, get to mood by talking about different events in chronological. And the power of this is, while it provides this sense of history and progression, it's up to you to highlight the significance of the event and to even choose which events show up. Your company might have 15 things that were important, but you're only going to show me 4 of them. And that choice of 4 could be different in one story and another when you go to tell them, because you're trying to emphasize different things. So it's not just what you say, it's also what you leave out that's an important part of chronological order, because not everything has to be there. The human mind will fill in a bunch of those gaps. Cause and effect is actually a more explicit form of what's going to happen. You explain how one event leads to another. And here you really do want to think hard about what really is cause and what's correlation, or what's just relationship. So the idea here is to define root causes and effects. This can be particularly effective when you're trying to use tactical writing to convince somebody who is themselves logical. Less effective if they're more emotionally driven. But if you can show A causes B causes C, and if we want to address C, let's address A because of the causation. That gives you a very effective way to write persuasively to convince people. It has the secondary advantage of offering potential solutions, because if I want to stop C from happening and A causes B causes C, I can either attack A or B, because either one of those leads to C, and so there's multiple ways you can do it. Things can be partially interrelated, and so they're not necessarily purely causal. They may be factors that influence them. to help understand that, there's this idea of what's called a fishbone drawing, where in the drawing here, right, you would actually basically write out terms that these two things come together to cause the green thing to happen. The green thing plus these two things make the cyan thing happen. That the cyan plus these two things make the purple thing. I mean, here they're symmetrical because it looks more like a fish, but you could have branches where this one's got 5 and this one's got 1, right? You can do whatever. But trying to actually formalize what happens in a cause and effect can actually help significantly improve your thinking. And oddly enough, this is something where you might want to do this, and then in the end, you can't quite show everything you want. So you might go back and use one of the other story styles, not this style. If you can't actually complete everything in the diagram, you don't want to use this. But if you really understand cause and effect, it's great. But it also helps improve your thinking, and then you might use some other story technique in terms of structure to get there. You can also, again, when you're going to do sort of a blended thing or interwoven stories, right, you can have cause and effect for a small piece, and then have a bigger element that's talking from a different structure, correlation, chronological order, or some other style that you mix them into. Another format which is popular with me, which you've seen in the book, is really presenting stuff into list formats and enumerated things. It's very popular in digital media. It can help break down complex information. It's often accompanied by visuals. It's easily shareable on social media. I like it because from a student learning point of view for the textbook like this, it allows them to quickly say, okay, here are the important points. I don't have to have all these words. Again, the number of words is not necessarily really correlated with what we want to have in terms of sticky stories. So this makes it have short, bulleted things. I don't have to worry about connecting them all in a coherent story. It's not the most storytelling format of a story. So you often have to use listicle formats in a braided sense, interwoven with other storytelling techniques to make it work. So all of these are things that I have found particularly effective for tactical writing. Now we'll touch on one or two, just to give some examples. So the circular narrative is where the story ends where it began, or it begins where it ended, right? It depends on how you want to tell it, like where you put in time. But this is the idea of sort of time spinning around, and something happens, and it explores the themes of repetition and closure. It can have a sense of timelessness, returns to the beginning, right? It's really hard because this is not a realistic structure. If it's going to be done in a way that you want for tactical writing, it's normally that when you return, you're changed. So I can think of this as a person where they go through this journey, again, the hero's journey kind of thing. When the hero comes back, they're not exactly the same. They could come back exactly the same and do the whole thing again. This could be Groundhog Day and over again. But it could also be that I come back a different person. I've grown in some way. And that is the one way that this can be used tactically. When you're looking at things that involve social change and growth, then this can be an effective technique. Another one which could be useful, but I find difficult to use in tactical storytelling, uses letters or conversations for storytelling. So letters can create this sort of intimacy, a sense of immediacy that's going on. Characters get to tell their story subtly through what's going on. It feels like reading a bunch of private correspondences. There's voice and personalities that come through. And this can engage the reader in a very personal way. So if I was looking at this for a tactical writing, I would use this when the whole point is a very personal story that's going to engage an audience, generally a very small audience where I have a lot of knowledge, because I want to know how they're going to react to these sort of private, very personal kinds of things. And it's mostly about the feelings you get and less about the information. There can be, in the letters or conversations, there can be some storytelling that gets into information, but this is mostly about the story and the feelings. But there are times when you're in tactical writing, that's where you want to get at. This is classically done either by saying, using a hypothetical person or real people in terms of what they're saying, and having a conversation between two of them, or sometimes between them and the reader or the narrator who's telling the story. So when you're playing your storytelling triangle, this is a tricky one to pull off. See where it's going to go. So now I'm going to come back. I said there would be 10 plus 11. So I'm not going to tell you the one that, and I'm putting this one last because it's this way it's easier to remember. It's not in the middle. And this is Oscar. And Oscar is what I consider the integral elements of a story in order. It's got the opening where you want a broad hook. And so we have this very big funnel because I want to make this apply to all kinds of things. And then I'm going to set the stage. I'm going to narrow what exactly am I talking about. I'm going to go through the challenge and the action, and then there's going to be some resolution. In the resolution, you'll notice I have opening back up, and the idea here is that the resolution has got to tie back to the opening. So if I start with something that is very important and very broad, let's say I'm talking about trying to deal with sustainability issues, and then I get to something narrower, which is how do I deal with a particular problem. Let's say we're looking at battery recycling or whatever. And then there's a challenge, there's some technical issues, then there's some actions that we want to take to improve the situation of battling. But then when you get to the resolution, we're going to tie back to the opening. We're going to resolve, yes, we can do this, and this is going to help the broader sustainability and climate change, whatever. You can tie it back to this broad thing. You want the broad hook and the resolution because you want everyone to feel they can be part of the audience. And then you want to suck them in and get them to read more and more and more as it goes through. So I also like Oscar as its name because in terms of that opening and then broadening back out, I like to think of it like the Oscar statue. Broad shoulders, narrows down, and then opens back up at the bottom so it has a strong base. And that's what you want out of your storytelling, right? So you can notice that this actually can be easily structured as a variation of either the 3 or a 5 stage. There are 5 stages here, but these 3, right, could be combined, or these 2 could be combined, right? This is the Act 1, these are Act 2. This is, setting the stage is normally part of Act 1, so this would be Act 1, Act 2, and then Act 3. All of those, relates back to classic storytelling. So, how to remember them? Well, if you remember Oscar, think of the statue you just saw, and then the opening, setting the stage, challenge, action, and resolution. The other reason I like to have students learn and use Oscar is that Oscar, in my view, is a technique that is easily applied recursively. And by recursively, I mean you apply it first at the top level of your paper. Then you apply it at the section level. So every section has its own sort of Oscar structure. Even at the paragraph level, right, you have Oscar. You have the opening of the paragraph. You have some core content. There may be a little bit less setting of the stage. There may be a little bit less challenge in the paragraph. But there's generally the opening, the action, and the resolution, and maybe a little bit of the other 2. Even at the sentence level, right, you can get here and you can rearrange them and place some orders. There's a lot more variety here. So you can have the opening, the action, the resolution. You can actually do the resolution followed by the action, where you tell them this because this happened. You can put them together in lots of ways. But the 5 elements of Oscar keep reoccurring over and over again. And so when you're doing this, right, it helps you understand that I'm going to structure it and then restructure it, right? And as opposed to having some sort of interwoven stories where I mix together different strategies, you have one strategy, you become good at it, you just keep reapplying it through your paper. And for lots of tactical writing, this is a very good technique. And Oscar, right, in the opening here, doesn't say that broad hook is not really the bottom line on top. The resolution, as I said, I like to have it both top and bottom. There's some bottom line, there's some broad hook. We're talking about how we're going to solve this problem. I don't have to tell them how. I'm really getting excited about what that problem is. And then at the end, I tie it back. So you can still do a little bit of the bottom line on top in an Oscar structure. Now, one of the things that's important when you're trying to use Oscar, but it's actually true for almost every story, is you got to, once you have your story ideas and you want to focus on or organize them, you have to put them together, and you have to learn how to focus on what's important. So what do you see here? What is this? If I was telling the story, what would you say this is the story of? If I look at the individual little pieces, it's hard to tell what this scene is. But if I learn to frame what's important, right? If I said this was a chair by the beachside, right? You instantly know everything you expect to see in the thing. If you tell me this is what the grass looks like, this is what the chair looks like, or this is what the wood looks like, because you don't, in this version, you don't even see it as a chair. You just see some wood, right? You see some rocks, you see some more. It's not clear. You might have guessed it, but you want to put it together. So the opening of your Oscar is critical to framing the paper. It's the first sentence should be very audience-specific hook that brings them in and gets them to understand what's going on. And you really want this to be a hook, intellectually or emotionally for the audience, right? And if you can, this is the ideal time to introduce this metaphor, where in the second sentence, in this opening, you're telling them this is like that, but different. Or this is the analogy we're going to use, right? That kind of stuff quickly gets the bottom line of what you're trying to address early in the opening. And it's worth spending lots of time on this. In each section, but especially for the abstract, for the first words people will read in your paper. And if you have an abstract, introduction, conclusion, all three of these have a critically important opening. Because when people are reading, when you're reading especially science papers, most people don't read them all. They read bits and pieces and then decide, I'm going to read more. You've probably all been guilty of this. You'll see in some article, you look through it, right? And maybe it's even clickbait where the title is trying to make you go read it, right? Sometimes for me, the more clickbait it is where it doesn't tell me anything useful in the title, then the rest of the article will tell me nothing useful either. If the article title tells me something, then maybe there's more detail in the paper. So I've drawn my own conclusions about how things work based on their opening. By their headline will tell me if I'm going to bother to read it. Not because it's trying to get me to, they're trying to induce that, but that doesn't always work. So the openings are really important. So the second is setting the scene, right? And the intro should have bed of sitting for the context, for the theme and metaphor, but it's really important. But not that you want to talk about the importance of the problem, not the difficulty of the problem. The challenge will come later. You want to talk about why it's important the problem be solved. What is the danger if it's not solved? What are the most relevant existing prior work? Well, why we should care. When I'm looking at a proposal or a science paper, this is what you have to hit in the introduction and setting up the scene, maybe even a little bit in the abstract, right? This is not putting the bottom line on top like telling them what the answer is, but it is in a sense, because if you're saying we're solving this problem and this problem is critical because, and you go through all that, right? The setting the scene would also be setting up any non-standard or important terms to make sure people know what's going on. It's a little bit boring, but if you start using acronyms or terms that your audience doesn't know, you lose them very quickly. So you've got to make sure this gets in. And find some way of doing that within the story. Or again, if you're using a metaphor, the metaphor can help them understand non-standard terms to them and put it together. And again, this is really framing the problem and showing the reader that others have worked on it in related areas too. And you want to be very positive in this point, not too critical. Your goal is not to say that prior people were idiots and they couldn't solve the problem. You want to say prior people made good progress on this problem, but it's still not solved and we need to really solve it. And the challenge part of Oscar, this is the core elements of your story. This is where you build up the difficulty of the problem, you set up for risk and danger. This is where your character really comes alive and starts doing stuff. In the setting of the scene and the problem, your character isn't driving that. The world is, the environment is. That problem exists independent of your character. But now when you get to the challenge, your character gets to sort of making it seem like it's difficult. What's got to be solved that makes it there. The risk and danger, right? That's for the world. That can be for your character. Either way, you want to set some of that up. In the challenge, you want to be talking about the previous steps, what was good, and what was good about them is actually important to helping establish your credibility. If you say these other people did a lousy job, and the reader thinks that person was the best that there was so far, then you've lost credibility. You want to acknowledge they did good things and try to make it work. So especially in proposal space and in scientific writing, this is critical that you acknowledge that the previous work was good. Ideally, the challenge should resonate with the reader. It should include details that help them make the connection. Why is this difficult? Why does the reader find this difficult to do? And why do I care that you're going to make it something that I want to see done? Okay. Then the next stage, the action. This is where your character shines. This is where your character is. You're presenting your solution, the problems, right? You introduce the challenge. Whatever that is, your character is going to work through and evolve a solution to the problem. Whether it's the science story where you're telling what the science is, or the marketing story where they can see the sizzle of the burger and now they're hungry, right? There's some action going on for your character here. Okay, you want to make it clear why the action solves the problem. Okay, just having data that says you solve the problem isn't going to convince most people. There are some people who are very data-oriented when we talked about different personality types, but most of them want an explanation to understand why. Some of them will care about why in terms of emotion. Some will care about why in terms of science or whatever is going on behind the scenes, right? What's going on from a business point of view, right? You have to explain the why. And that sometimes means having credible data, references, that go into your story to make that happen, or credible references through a well-known figure that's respected, and quoting them is a way of getting various levels of credibility about why this is going to be important. Okay, if you have enough space and time, you want to make it clear how the action is viable and reasonable to implement, because you can have an idea that sounds why it's going to solve, but it's too expensive, right? You got to talk about what makes it viable, reasonable to implement, and who or what is needed to make it work. So this is, again, from a proposal point of view, critical. So you got to find a way to work this in other stories, in business, right? it may or may not be, right? Who's going to be needed to implement a business proposal is actually important. Do we have the people in the company? What's it going to cost? All of those are critical in business. Science, again, these can be important. But for marketing, maybe not, right? If it's like, who's going to need to make it? It's you decide to go get, the steak that you just saw sizzling on it. You're influenced the next time you're hungry to go get their product, right? The how and who and what depends on what your objective is. But ideally, there's some sort of call to action for the reader to get involved in implementing the action. The idea here is to make it a joint action. If you say, we're going to solve this problem, and the reader just has to watch, there's not much call to action on their part. If you bring them in as a partner to the action, now you have a way of engaging them. They're thinking about how's it going to work, what would they do. A joint action is a much stronger action. And if it's a call to action for them to do something that's going to benefit you, then don't focus on you, focus just on them. The action that they're going to do is going to make them happier is a much stronger place to be. And then finally, the last part of your Oscar is sort of the resolution, or we want to relate it back to the theme, reuse the metaphor. Again, this is reinforcing the same thing over and over again. You want to think about some papers talk about a conclusion, some things will have a discussion. And to me, there really is a difference. A conclusion really is a conclusion. You're drawing a conclusion. A discussion is a bunch of the issues. And when you can't reach a conclusion, then label the last section of your tactical effort a discussion, where you're discussing the issues that need to be resolved, versus a conclusion where you have resolved them. In my view, for the resolution at the end, is actually a good ordering for that section is actually Oscar in reverse. You start with the resolution. What happened? You review the action, you review a little bit of the setting scene, stating your contributions to now solving the problem that you introduced, and then you resolve the opening. We're back to having solved everything. So the resolution is Oscar, but Oscar reversed. So that's Oscar. Again, it's my variation on sort of the classic storytelling scheme, but all of the other techniques, except for the epistolary, I've used all of them in tactical writing situations. I know about their different uses in different situations, and you should sit down and think about what's going to go on. So before I finish Oscar, I wanted to come back to what we considered the 6 bare bones, one sentence version of the 8 essential elements, which we introduced in earlier chapters, right? Which is the character needed something because something, but something happens, so some action happens, finally we get a resolution, right? And the nice thing about this, in my view, is it maps very naturally to Oscar. It is the opening, which is where the character needed something, the setting, because a little bit about why it's happening, the challenge, but something is stopping it to happen, action, so something happens, and the resolution finally. And you can see why, in my view, storytelling, in terms of the 6 most essential elements, and Oscar are a very natural fit, because for me, they just line up neatly between each other. And yeah, there's 8 elements where we add some character details. If I apply Oscar recursively, in some of the settings, when I get into it, I'll have more detail and I can fill them in. So that's the story structure elements. Again, there's lots of other ways of structuring your story, but you want to make sure you are thinking about them in terms of the story elements and how you're going to deploy them in a story. And you might, before you get into writing, because we haven't actually started to get to your first drafts yet, you're going to want to take these story ideas, the story structures, and play with them a little bit. And my recommendation, just as a preview to where we go later, is to actually write first drafts that you don't care about the grammar, you don't care about anything. Turn off all of the grammar checking, turn off all the spell checking, maybe even don't even write. Just talk. Record yourself, put the pieces together, and then see what works. Until you're really comfortable with the relations of the stages to go in constructing a story and then putting it in structure, it's easier to do it very quickly and think about how to move stuff around. So that's it for Chapter 6. Thank you.